Tonight on Projexploitation.
The news spread slowly, almost casually at first, from one cop to another, from a police captain to a magistrate, and then it picked up speed and flew through the night, from the top to the bottom, from one end of the city to the other. Telephones rang shrilly. Lights went on in homes on the main line. Lights went on in downtown hotels, in homes and apartments, in all sections of the city. Men with suddenly stricken faces looked at worried wives or bored, sleepy girls. And then some of them took sedatives, and others took stimulants. And a few began packing bags and checking plane and train schedules. The lucky ones, the great honest majority, grinned at the news and went back to bed with the pleasant realization that heads would be rolling by tomorrow night. The big heat was coming.
Hollywood, the dream and the nightmare.
Someone to love or someone.
That's my dream.
Hey there. Got a light? You're probably looking for that Projexploitation racket. Well, you're going to be looking a long time if you stay on this program. There's nothing for you here. Well, since you're here, you might as well join us for some late night sax. You see, this here is Sax in the City, a broadcast where we talk film and the inky black heart that beats through their celluloid chests. I'm Tricky Nick Cheney, and my partner here is Dan Babbling Brooks. Dan, what's the rap?
You had to bring the big heat, didn't you? You had to tell Lagana off. You had to bring the big heat, didn't you? Your cop friends thought your head went soft. You had to start a one-man mob war. You had to shine your bright flashlight. You had to make the front page bold type, so then they rigged your car with dynamite. Whoa, whoa, to blow, oh, whoa, 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 to blow, oh, whoa, whoa. You get the idea.
That's some strange music. We don't get a lot of that around these parts. All right, I'm done with the bit.
Oh, yeah, it's like, you speak in strange sounds. What is this? No, anyway.
But your kids are going to love this.
That was very interesting music, Marty. I love that. So, and I know you're a Billy Joel fan, so I was like, all right. Billy Joel time, baby.
I was going to say, that was like actually the first one that I actually did know pretty instantaneously. So,
oh, good.
Appreciate it.
It really wrote itself. I mean, it's like, that's such a great song, and it's got such a percussive melody that, you can put a lot of different things there, and it all sounds decent.
You sure can.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, if you couldn't already tell, this is something a little different. This is, as I said up at the top, Sax and the City, where we talk about film noirs. You may be asking yourself, where is Projexploitation? I don't know. I don't know where it went, but I'm sure it'll be back.
Mm-hmm.
So don't you worry your pretty little head about it, baby, okay?
Everything gets a return, baby. Everything comes back around, and right now it's just off in the ether. And, but it'll materialize again.
By the way, Dan, has anyone ever called you Babbling Brooks before?
Oddly, no. Although, of course, I'm familiar with the phrase. But I think my sister might have gotten that moniker in, junior high.
Oh, see, that's just mean.
Yeah, it wasn't very affectionate. I mean, when you do it, it's affectionate. So I actually thought it was funny.
I was gonna say we're both adults here, and you like to talk, so.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, do I though? You noticed it, did you?
I was gonna say, well, if you didn't know it already, you'll learn it by the end of tonight because we are discussing The Big Heat, which is one of Dan Babeley-Brooks' favorites.
Yes.
Let me drop a little bit of info on the movie before we kick it to you, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
We are discussing The Big Heat, released in 1953, directed by the incomparable Fritz Lang in an American production. And of course, we'll get into the subtle shades of Lang. But the cast is comprised of Glenn Ford as Dave Banyan, Gloria Graham as Debbie Marsh, Jocelyn Brando, that's correct, Marlon's sister,
That's right,
as Katie Banyan, Alexander Scorby as Mike Lagana, Lee Marvin as Vince Stone, Jeanette Nolan as Bertha Duncan, and we've got rounding it out the pair of Peter Whitney as Tierney and Willis Boucher as Lieutenant Ted Wilkes. And it's just a brief little synopsis here. And I will say, normally I don't care about this, but there are slight spoilers in this synopsis, in the same way that if you were to write a synopsis about Psycho, you know, what happens in the first 30 minutes or so is almost spoilery because of the suddenness of the event. So if you haven't watched it, we just totally recommend you go watch it and then come right back. But if it's been a while, or if you're lazy like me sometimes, and you don't care, then here we go with the synopsis. Dave Banyan is an upright cop on the trail of a vicious gang he suspects holds power over the police force. Banyan is tipped off after a colleague's suicide, and his fellow officers' suspicious silence lead him to believe that they are on the gangster's payroll. When a bomb meant for him kills his wife instead, Banyan becomes a furious force of vengeance and justice, aided along the way by the gangster's spurned girlfriend Debbie. As Banyan and Debbie fall further and further into the gangland's insidious and brutal trap, they must use any means necessary, including murder, to get to the truth.
That's pretty damn good. That's a really good synopsis.
Yeah, when I read that, I completely agree. So, Dan Jeremy Brooks, not babbling. That is not your legal name.
You could use whatever alternately. It's totally fine. Just back, whatever.
Okay. Yeah, you know what? I'll just change it out every once in a while.
Be fun.
You were the inspiration for this episode, and of course, because you were the inspiration for this episode, you were kind of the inspiration for this new turn of events that may become a recurring thing here on the Projexploitation podcast. So don't adjust your dial. We did that for you earlier. And
that's right.
When we take another detour, we will point you in the right direction. So, Dan, you chose this film because it's wonderful. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to admit, I hope this does become a reoccurring beloved segment, if you will, because there's so much from this period. It's such a rich time for film noir. And it does occur to me, though, that this is Projexploitation's first honest-to-God film noir. I mean, it's Sex and the City, but it's also our first flat-out noir, Yeah. I mean, I guess Bad Girls Go to Hell has a little of that feel in the grittiness, but it's also a nudie cutie.
Honestly, it's probably the only thing that film noirs are missing, in my opinion.
That's a good point. I would agree. So a little bit about Fritz Lang. I've got a funny quote here from Mark Svetin, who writes for this thing called the Film Noir Sentinel. I think it comes out like twice a year. It's a PDF only, but it's like just all about film noir. I mean, it's like, and these guys, they write in a very energetic, fun style, and they're reviewing everything. They're interviewing anybody still alive. It's pretty great. But he said about Lang, he says, mixing unusual angles with bizarre close-ups, Lang employed an arsenal of unique shots as he ordered take after take, exasperating his collaborators and treating his actors like scenery. His crews were always on the verge of mutiny. Lang was known in Hollywood as the man with the monocle, the epitome of the German emigre. So that's a pretty good way to describe his U.S. years. one thing that was interesting, I kind of knew it, but I didn't really know much about it until a few weeks ago, was that his wife, who was also a major collaborator of his, Thea von Harbu, she was like a major screenwriter. I mean, she co-wrote Metropolis with him and M, and two of the Dr. Mabuse films,
yeah,
and that whole epic German Nibelungen film. It's the Rings of the Nibelungen, with the thing about all that. And she wrote like other screenplays for like Murnau and Carl Dreyer. I mean, she was in demand. Unfortunately, she turned into a Nazi when Hitler ascended to the chancellorship in 1933, and she ended up like writing or directing some 20 Nazi propaganda films. And Fritz Lang was like, yeah, see you later. And that was basically it. I mean, I think their relationship was a little estranged already, but then that kind of pushed it, over.
Yeah, usually that doesn't just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I have another quote here from Lade Eisner, who is a very good friend of Fritz Lang's, but she was also a very good critic and author. And she said that Fritz Lang was blessed with an infallible instinct for capturing the atmosphere of the country in which he was working, whether in Germany or the U.S. And it is striking how he was able to take these elements of German expressionism, which, I mean, he didn't invent them all by himself, but he was definitely one of the prime movers in the creation of that. And him coming over here and essentially applying that to the beginnings of post-war film noir, it's amazing how well they fit together. It's, hand in glove. And there's a lot of the same obsessions, the stuff like, I don't know, there's a lot about staircases. Like you'll see like spiraling stairs and people are like trapped on this, on the banister. There's a lot of stuff with mirrors and shadows, of course. But I have to say, I didn't realize he had done quite as many American films as he did. I think for a long time it was considered, well, his American films are kind of crap, but his German films are where it's at. And no, I mean, there were people who didn't think that. I mean, like Francois Truffaut of Cahiers de Cinema. I mean, he was like, oh, the American films are superior. Here's why. I mean, he wrote a glowing review for The Big Heat. And he also took some critics to task. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was pretty funny. I mean, basically he was saying they were almost senile or something. I don't know. But as time has gone on, his American movies have gotten a much bigger reputation, and Big Heat is definitely like, up in the front there. I was reading these interviews Fritz Lang did with Peter Bogdanovich, in the mid 60s. And he said that basically, Fritz Lang just said if he had to kind of explain what the themes in all his movies are, he said it's hate, murder, and revenge, and the fight against fate. And revenge is a bitter and evil fruit. And I think that's absolutely correct. I think, well, first let me ask you a question.
Me or the audience?
Well, you, I guess, because I honestly,
okay.
I mean, it's kind of a long question, but okay, so I've been wondering, I'm trying to think how often a character like Dave Banyan had appeared in American films prior to this movie, which was 1953. Like, you had like anti-heroes, right? You had James Cagney characters like in White Heat and The Public Enemy and stuff like that. And then you had like tragic heroes like Kane, or like Paul Muni and I'm a Fugitive from Chain Gang. But that's all like more like about circumstance and like mostly a good person who has a tragic flaw. And then you've got like, then you always had like, there were corrupt cops in movies, although quite a bit less after the Hays Code came in. But those guys were always punished. They always got their comeups and they were never main characters. I can't think of anybody like Dave Banyan. He's a decent, super honest policeman and family man. And he suddenly, boom, grief and rage hit him like a ton of bricks. And he goes on this Revenger style spree. He goes on, actually, it's a hate binge, if you will, to quote Detective Burke. I love that phrase. I always think about that phrase, hate binge, whenever I think about this movie, because it's perfect. It's a perfect description of how, like, almost addictive the rage is for him. It becomes all consuming. And I guess, I don't know. This might be something to talk about another day, but I'll just say really fast. I think there's an interesting split between the Revengers of up until like Dirty Harry and then the ones after, where prior to Dirty Harry, which is like 1971, You got people who are flirting with illegality. You've got, Dave Banyan. He's trying to do the right thing, but he's tempted to murder, and he comes really close a couple times. But like then after with Dirty Harry, it's like it's like gleeful violence. Illegal vigilante violence, no apology. And so it feels like even the really good revengers after Dirty Harry, for the most part, they kind of tacitly sign off on the guy who's doing the revenge, usually through either just, subjective cinematic techniques or whatever, or they just make the antagonist do more and more awful, vicious stuff. So it's like, well, he's justified. It's like he's inoculated in advance to do whatever he wants. And go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, yeah. Oh,
you go.
No, we're going to do this all night. No, I'm kidding. I was just going to say, because I know you're a fan, this movie, Big Heat, isn't like those. It reminds me much more of Memento and Three Billboards, where it shows that it's a revenge, pretty unsatisfying proposition and kind of based on failure of imagination. Well, and definitely empathy. So anyway, I was just kind of curious if you thought, are there antecedents, I guess, to this guy?
That I can't quite talk to, because unfortunately movies prior to 1960 are probably collectively a blind spot. I mean, I've certainly seen a fair share of them.
That's fair. Sure.
But
sure.
My biggest decades to date would be 70s and 80s, clearly, as to why we're doing this in general.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
But I definitely think that was what you're speaking to, is certainly the general trend. And to comment a little bit on what you were talking about, the kind of the after Dirty Harry, era, and I think that's spot on. But the other thing is, you almost have to separate them into two different categories moving forward, between civilians and cops revenge films, because those are two different narratives, not simply just because they're centered around two different characters, but the ethos of a cop deciding to take the law into their own hands is a completely different narrative impetus than a civilian who oftentimes in these movies finds the cops to be ineffectual,
right? So
therefore takes the law into their own hand. And that's often why we got a huge wave of certainly Dirty Harry inspired films, but almost undoubtedly more empowering, even if sleazy and icky in a lot of ways. When it was people like Robert Forster, cocking a shotgun because his wife got murdered and the cops won't, do anything about it. In Vigilante, actually, he was in quite a few of that exact plot. It was like he was in Walking the Edge. He was in Vigilante. There's like another one, but there was a huge wave of kind of vigilantism, which, even crops up into subgenres themselves. I mean, Billy Jack is basically a vigilante film, not necessarily for any one particular act of violence, although at the end there is one in particular. But in general, Billy Jack wanders the land that is definitely not his and dons an identity that is not his to don, but he does it in order to, enact peace between, but also revenge upon the white man who dares to come onto their reservation. Oh boy, that movie is so problematic. I love it.
We got to do that an episode on that one time too. I know.
Oh, yeah. We for sure will. But I think those are two different things, because
good point.
That's like a branching path of the moment it became acceptable. I think we, myself included, but society in general started to conflate that and started to think that, oh yeah, it's the same thing, when in reality it's not really morally the same thing, because it's wrong no matter what. But there's a difference between a guy who says he needs a bigger hammer and a guy who just needs a hammer to begin with.
That's very true. And you're right. There is a real division there. And as you said, the vigilante one's about civilians, if you will, non-police. Those ones in particular, I find, are very often, not always, but often very manipulative. And they're very much like, oh, the police are so ineffectual. They're very much like what I would call just so stories. They have to be crafted just like this in order for us to get our...
Oh, yeah. They stack the deck.
to get our like collective jollies off on the revenging thing. Yeah, they stack the deck exactly.
Yeah.
There's I read the novel for the Big Heat, which is Big Heat's pretty faithful, by the way, to the novel. And I'm not going to go into it a ton because, we're here to talk about the movie, of course. But one thing in the novel that they talked about was he's casting Glenn Ford's interesting because Banyan in the novel is actually very physically big and very powerful. And he is a guy who works super hard to keep a close check on his temper. And I think that's part of what makes his kind of descent, temporary descent into nihilism so more tragic to watch, because he struggles with it. And in the novel, they sketch it out in a couple really well-chosen sentences and passages. And I think it's some of the best I've ever read describing like that afterwards. I don't know if you experience this, but this afterwards embarrassment of expressing rage, and then you have the self-reproach because you're like, oh shit, I'm not in control of myself. And like this novel, like almost better than anybody I've read, it shows him this feeling of disgust towards yourself, because you're not being careful. You've had an uncareful moment. And then you have that feeling, that mixture of humiliation and self-loathing and the aftermath, of the whole, you've lost your cool. And, and it's not just out of a sense, for me at least, it's not just out of a sense of shame for other people seeing it, although that's part of it too. But it's like I let myself down. I almost feel like it feels like it feels like I'm an addict or something, where I've had several months of hard-won sobriety, and I've really worked hard. And then one night I flush it down the drain on a bender, and I have to go, okay, I'm starting over again. And, basically it's a hate binge. It's like what the Detective Burke says. Like I said, that's one of my favorite moments in that movie. And I always think about that because it is such an accurate description of that. Like, just, like, I don't know if you feel it, but there's like, it's partially fight or flight, I guess, or adrenaline, but there's this tangy zip, if you will, of like a rust flavoring in your mouth. Like when you just are like, you finally lose your shit and like all the defenses get, and I think it's addictive. Honestly, I think it's probably as addictive as anything. And I think you see that at Dave Banyan because he has so little else in his life now. He thinks his life is essentially over, and he's not even spending that much time with his daughter. I mean, you see her with him a little, but for the most part, he's
3 little kittens.
Oh my God. I'll never think about,
Lost their mittens.
Oh, I know. And then later she asked him to do the story again. I'm like, why? But anyway. But, and I think, I do think, it's like there's this phrase from Robert Lowell, where he calls it the nourishment of drama, where you're like, when you don't have much else going, that can get really addictive to have that replenished drama, and I think Glenn Ford does do, even though he's not a huge guy, he does a really good job of showing he's like got the slow burn, especially when he goes to see the owner of the, it's Victory Auto Wreckers. That old car's worth money.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. Victory Auto Wreckers, even back then, who knew? But when he goes to see him and he's talking and he's getting more and more upset because the guy keeps sloughing him off with a bunch of bullshit, and he's like, well, can I go talk to the other? No, I can't allow you to. Well, can I see his tool? No, those are my tools. It's just like, the slow burn is happening. And I think that's one of the things that's so intriguing about it. It's almost a hoary cliche in revenge films, but it's the reason why it's a cliche is because it resonates so deeply, which is how do you struggle against this thing without becoming indistinguishable from that thing? Like I was saying, I was reading this interesting book called The Big Heat by Colin MacArthur. And it's off of BFI. It's the British Film Institute, just this little book. But he talks a lot about that, about like how the movie from the point after the bomb explodes, how it's like Lang is almost stripping away all the differences between Banyan and like Stone and Lagana slowly to the point where like his hotel room is like this dark place that's like, I don't think lights are ever on in that hotel. And it's just, it's really a reflection of just the sort of poverty of his soul at that moment.
Yeah, it says a lot that he vacates his residence immediately after,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't mean just leaves, I mean like guts it, which I found very interesting because on the one hand, I kind of understand the logistics of like maybe needing to relocate. On the other hand, I don't know that movies were operating on that level of plot detail, so I think it was more of a character detail than a plot one.
I agree.
But to show that he was basically no longer able to see himself in this kind of domestic bliss in those harsh lights.
Yes, exactly. And depending on who you talk to, some will say, well, Banyan, he gets close to the edge, but he never goes over it. And to an extent, that's true. I mean, like there's that part at the end where he's got the gun on Vince Stone, and you can literally see him pulling the trigger. Like you can see the chamber moving,
I'm going to say, I almost thought I heard it go empty for a moment as if he did it, but then it didn't. But then I realized he went all the way, but not to the very end, Right.
So, I mean, in a way, I think, yes, he does allow the law to come in each time, and he doesn't, strangle, what's that guy, Larry Gordon, to death.
Oh, right.
Although he basically makes the guy a dead man, so there's that.
And there are moments, for example, that even when he's losing himself, that it's clear that he is still in there, because when the scene in which you're talking about earlier about him at the scrapyard, when he's talking to that guy, he's treating him just like any other criminal that he talks to or whatever. But the moment the guy ends the conversation saying, "I've got a wife and kid too," it's one of the few conversations from that point on that does not end with him punching somebody out.
That's actually very true. And in a way, it's you're right. You can see him in there, and inversely, before Katie is killed, you can see that rage he's keeping down a little too. Like, and I hate to put it in such stark terms, but I mean, I suppose at this point I should just mention that basically Banyan's need to immediately confront Lagana after the phone call where they're insulting his wife and everything, it pretty directly leads to her death. I mean, obviously it's not what he intended, but his need to defend her honor and, and then of course him, easily just punching out the bodyguard. You can see there's this part of him right under the surface, and it's unfortunately sometimes the people he loves end up paying the price, Actually, I want to say something about the bombing scene too. And I think I said this to you the other day. Yeah. It's like, I don't know what it is that's so disturbing. Well, it's very disturbing in general, but it's like the score is composed like right up to the very edge. And it's almost like, I remember I heard a couple composers once refer to, like when you're scoring something in reaction to like several dialogue and action beats, like within a scene, like they sometimes would call it, Mickey Mousing, although I think Bugs Bunnying was probably more correct. But it's like that. You've got this lullaby theme when he's tucking in his daughter and the three little kittens, and then bam, it's right in the middle of the lullaby. The explosion goes off and it just gets steamrolled by the sound effects and some very fast bowing minor cellos. And it's for some reason I find that more disturbing that there isn't that little pause between. Like a lot of directors would have a sort of a moment between, but this is it just rams right into each other, which is, basically what happens is suburban existence is just totally blown away all of a sudden.
And it's really not something he ever even took into consideration, despite the fact that he knows just how powerful and ruthless they are, because that's the whole problem. So the idea that he would be in some ways off limits, is a blind spot of his. So it quite literally takes him by surprise.
Yeah, well, and it's also, it's funny because, again, the mirror image of that is Lagana when he goes to visit him at his daughter's, I don't know, whatever her party is. And Lagana gets like, he turns on a dime. He gets furious. At first, he's very, this is a picture of my mother. And what can I help you with? What benevolent society do you need some donation? And he goes, no, I want to ask you about homicide. And he flips out. And he basically says, I don't want some cop bringing his dirty shoes into my place. So in a way, it's sort of like what happens with Banyan, where he's got this almost idyllic, it's very paradisical suburban existence. I mean, it's beautiful. And it's like, he suddenly realizes there wasn't that line that big bright line separating these two worlds.
Yeah, sure. So this was my second viewing. I think I saw this for the first time 4 or 5 years ago or so, and very much enjoyed it the first time. Thought it was quite good. And, film noir is not something I automatically like. I always love the visual, so it's like, for the most part, I'm always down to watch one. But unfortunately, if I'm watching, something that's Raymond Chandler-esque,
Sure.
it gets too convoluted for me. So I always need some kind of postmodern take on that kind of noir, like Inherent Vice or, Belong Goodbye or something where I feel like it's being obtuse for a reason. So a lot of times, these plots kind of drag me through the mud a little bit. The Big Heat, obviously, is a very simple story, which is not pejorative. It's only about one thing, and it's got a cast of characters that's easy to track, and it's amazing how that goes a long way. And obviously, with Fritz Lang behind the camera, it's one of the most gorgeous film noirs ever made. I love his attention to interiors rather than exteriors. Film noirs are usually in the alleys, whereas his is right inside the residences, and it's almost scarier that way because that's obviously what's encroached upon in Dave Bannion's life as he starts to try to unravel it. The other thing I really, especially when rewatching, I really like about this movie is that there's no mystery. The opening scene tells you pretty much everything without a line of dialogue. You see the cop committing suicide, the wife coming down with a pretty nonchalant attitude, and then calling a mob boss. So there's never any, validity of Dave Bannion's, suspicions called into question. Where we know exactly what he knows because it's not a well-kept secret. So because of that, we're more able to focus on the characters and on the visuals and see the way Dave Bannion starts to kind of lose himself on this journey. And I think the first 30 minutes or so before the bomb goes off are certainly pretty great. I love the scenes of domestic bliss where when I rewatch them, I can kind of see that something is off, not in their marriage, but in the way that it's almost not quite satirical, but certainly too picturesque to be good, to be true, almost to an extent. I mean, when they're sitting down to eat and he's like, hey, how about I take a sip of your beer and you drink mine?
Right.
It's like, who are you performing for? But they have this very Donna Reed-esque, relationship that is actually tender and actually full of love and whatnot, but also, unfortunately, looks like it was a time bomb waiting to explode. And by the time that bomb does go off, it's all the more shocking, but it's also that much more thematically fitting when it does, so that those music cues and whatnot that were playing were kind of telling you that the show was about to end any moment now. So it's kind of it's setting off one fuse to light another, basically, and the trajectory of that I think is so well handled. I have one minor gripe with this movie, and I say that as someone who pretty much thinks it's perfect. I mean, I don't, whatever, but my only real gripe about this, and maybe you can persuade me otherwise, maybe you can't, we'll see, but that's on you, but begin. No.
All right, cracking my knuckles over here. Let's see. Yep. Give me your worst. No, go on. I'm sorry.
No. For me, is the last 10 to 15 minutes. I think most of the action is good and quite well done and whatnot. But I have two bones that I kind of pick at while I watch it, which is one, I'm not entirely convinced by the cops coming around when they do.
Interesting.
I feel like maybe I missed something, and that is the age of, unfortunately, I am able to check my phone when I watch something, but when the sergeants and the lieutenants show up after, Lagana got the guards to essentially walk away.
Right.
And he visits the apartment, and when Dave comes down to the end of the steps and they show up and they're like, no, you know what, we're with you.
Mm-hmm.
What was the impetus there? Because the whole movie, they're the opposite. You know, they're like, don't do this. This isn't. And for me, I need some kind of reasoning that, and I didn't quite understand what it was. And I'm not saying I would take the movie to task for it, but it is something that just kind of shows up when it needs to. And I almost don't even think it needed to. Like, I think they could have just been turned if they had showed up in the final scene for the first time and just seen the big picture, because Dave Banyan pretty much solved it all, but also didn't kill, you know, whatever. If they would have showed up to that scene, that I would have understood, like, okay, let's get you out of here, and maybe we can, you know, like, you solved one problem, even though no one wanted to, you know. So I don't know. Is there something I'm missing of an actual concrete scene that may shine a light as to why they would just show up when they do? Is it Lagana calling off the guards themselves, where they're like, that's not right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that some of my favorite stuff is when the brother-in-law brings over the
army buddies
with their service revolvers. I mean, that dialogue is, like, again, straight out of the novel, and it's classic stuff. And it's all like, oh, your one-man occupation of the Philippines, we're gonna hear the story again, you know, or whatever. But the one thing about Wilkes and Burke is, well, Burke is definitely Banyan's friend all through. He's only in a few scenes, but he's the one who tells him, you need to slow your roll here.
Right.
And it's in that scene now that the first time you see it, it's easy to kind of miss it. But I think, I've seen it a few times now. So that's, I think, when Lang is dropping little subtle clues. He'll say, oh, Wilkes is trying to find you a list of mechanics who might have know how to blow up cars. And he's like, well, don't let him, you know, jeopardize his pension over me. And he's like, oh, man, you got Wilkes all wrong. And he's like, yeah, well, you know, talk is cheap, basically. And in a way, it's true. I think Wilkes, obviously at the end, he's a decent guy. And, I mean, I do love that whole part where they're like, we're showing up here to make it official, you know, and he's, you know, breathing the free air, if you will.
Yeah.
So I do enjoy that aspect.
Do you think at all a part of it is that could Wilkes and Burke be almost, particularly Wilkes, but be almost play acting, like suspending him on purpose, so that way they don't have to pretend with someone like Lagana that, you know, that they're enabling this, and in reality, they're almost kind of using Dave Banyan, not in an evil sociopathic way, but like, hey, if you can get this done, you know, more power to you.
I mean, in a way, I could kind of see it. You know, it's funny in the novel. There's a lot of talk about the corruption within the police department, but it's all this stuff about, like, well, you don't really need to have everybody in the place be corrupt. You only need a few well-placed people. And so there's this constant feeling of paranoia, like, I don't know, this guy I could go 50-50 on. I don't know what I think. You know, like, now it turns out Burke is actually totally on the level. But at the same time, there is this feeling like, well, who can we even trust? Who's going along with it because they feel powerless? And who's actually on the take? Who's actually getting money? Like, you know, for instance, the policeman who dies, of course, he was making money hand over fist. I mean, he had a place in Atlantic City. I mean, it's like, well, you know, policeman with a summer home is, like, you know, pretty ridiculous, you know?
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know if they were kind of, well, you know, maybe you're right, actually, because at the end, they find Bertha Duncan, and they assume Banyan killed her.
True.
But they don't rush and arrest him.
Right.
They're like, well, we wanted to give you a little time. And it's like, time to do what?
They literally say, like, we sorry you got there first, but that was it. Like, they don't say...
Yeah, they're not even like, damn it, man, that's murder. They're like,
yeah.
You know, but I mean, so maybe they are kind of like, well, we're just going to set you loose and let you do whatever you want to do, because maybe it'll be more expeditious if you do it. I don't know. Right.
Because you're not going to join us, so therefore you might as well go on this crusade.
Right. Well, you know, it's one of the things, the other things in the novel is it shows that Banyan's like actually very much has a pretty big life of the mind. Like, he'll come home from work and he'll be on the late shifts. It'll be like 2 a.m. and him and his wife will sit on the couch and hang out and, you know, trade, you know, little witty repartee, and he'll read like Immanuel Kant, or something like that. And it's which I mean, I know you recently, I believe, got something by him. Did you purchase something by Kant?
It's right over there. And that's not me lying. I mean, it is literally right over there.
Right.
But I'll knock over like a million books to get to it.
Oh man, I have the same problem. But I don't know. I just find Kant laughable. I don't know what it is. No, it's from Kicking and Screaming. It's one of those like stray lines where Chet just says something and then you move on. You're like, you only hear like this little part of the conversation. You're like, where were they going with that? But yeah, he even said, like in the book, he talks about how he gets a lot of, as a policeman, even though he sees a lot of awful things, he gets a lot of strength from what he calls the gentle philosophers, which are people like, let's see, I got the list. St. John of the Cross, Kant, Spinoza, Santayana, the ones who thought it was natural for man to be good and that evil was an aberrant course, abnormal and accidental and out of line with man's true needs and nature. And I think that's, again, it partly makes his descent so tragic, but I mean, fortunately, it's not a permanent one. And I actually, that's one of the other things I love about the movie. And I mean, in the book, it's probably accentuated a lot too. But in the movie, he's got this, like, it's like his nihilism is proved false over and over and over by the community. And I almost sometimes think of it as like the film noir version of It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. Where it's like, cause that's got some dark moments. I was actually
reminded, I thought it was slightly Capra-esque.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Where all these people kind of come in. And it's funny because in the novel at the end, he even goes, it turns out I couldn't do it alone. I thought I could, but I needed this guy this coroner in this other place that helped me out. And this priest who, came over here and did this for me. And these guys who helped protect my daughter. And he's kind of musing like, I needed that community. I couldn't do it on my own. And my mistake was trying to do it on my own. I think that's a really powerful message that resonates with me very, very strongly. And I mean, he's even getting help from strangers. I mean, like that, of course, that scene at the Victory Auto Wreckers with the Selma Parker. She helps him twice. And I mean, really puts herself in danger the second time. And she doesn't know him from Adam. I mean, in a way, it was funny. It reminded me of that villain in, the movie Prisoners, the Melissa Leo's character. Yeah. Yeah. And she has the weirdest motivation at the end where she's like, talks about how like the reason she's kidnapping and killing children, she's trying to make good people lose faith in God. And she says, turn them into demons. And it's sort of like the Hugh Jackman character does in a sense get at least temporarily turned into a demon. And you see that with Banyan, where he's just hit by this unthinkable tragedy. And he almost goes over, but he keeps getting snapped back over and over by the kindness of family and the kindness of strangers, And I think that is one of the things I find so moving about the movie. And I definitely think that's the reason why I wanted to have that quote from the McGivern, the William McGivern novel, The Big Heat, at the beginning, because it does show an entire community of people who, for the most part, the vast majority are living ethical lives. And, I thought that quote really captures that. While I'm here, I should also say thank you to Troy Sterling Nees for performing that opening part. Troy and I met, several decades ago, on a site that was a songwriters forum back when the internet was relatively young, actually. Sterling's an absolutely fantastic composer, but his music, his compositions they have this ability to be both elating and also at the same time very eldritch, if you will, which is probably a word I'm using partly because of his work for the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. He's scored their radio plays, which are wonderful too. And also he's the composer and one of the producers of the Diabolical Tales Radio Hour, which I know I've talked about a fair amount in the past. But Troy just performed it perfectly. I'd asked him to do kind of a more deadpan performance because I knew the music underneath was going to be fairly propulsive. impulsive. And, he delivered exactly that. It was very low-key and just the right thing for the intro. So shout out to Troy Sterling Nees.
Appreciate it.
But I know what you mean in a way. You're not the only person who felt that Wilkes' change was odd. I remember reading 2 other reviewers from that year who were like, well, that seemed a little odd. But I mean, then again, on the other hand, Truffaut thought it made perfect sense because he was like, oh, well, if you look at the dialogue from earlier. So,
yeah, it's definitely not something, like I had mentioned, that I would take it to task for. Like, I pretty much think this movie is, pitch perfect. But, for me, for whatever reason, I probably will never watch that scene without doing a half second. Okay. Kind of,
yeah, like
whatever. But I do think that, the more I think about the idea of them essentially just letting him be Lone Wolf McCade, I pretty much actually don't think that that's even like an interpretation, like a BuzzFeed theory. Like, I actually think that there's valid arguments to be made that that's what they are doing. So in that lens, I do appreciate that they're essentially dropping the charade and coming at the moment that they're basically allowed to drop it. So I think what you're touching on, though, is pretty much what does make it pretty unique, which is that kind of, like I said, Capra-esque, that warmness of the community coming through and whatnot. And that's also what's directly responsible for the movie being as dark as it is. Because in a movie that has, this kind of bliss to it at times, sometimes you watch a film noir and it doesn't feel all that dark because everyone's just an asshole. So it's more just kind of like, okay, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, there's no contrast.
Yeah, like, I don't really care when someone double crosses the double crosser, I mean, it's fun, intellectually, sure, whatever. But I don't go, oh, she got you, whatever.
No, I agree.
But in this movie, this movie doesn't just have a scene where Debbie gets the coffee thrown on her.
Right.
It has the prelude of that moving up to where, when she is first starting to get beaten, that, the one guy jumps up to almost intervene. And, because even characters in the movie are not completely sadistic and they're like, whoa,
right.
Well, that's not okay. But then, of course, the other character is like, hey, if you want to be next, go ahead. But, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is such an interesting scene, not just because it's the famous coffee throwing thing is one of the things everybody knows about. Even people who haven't seen the movie know about that. But it is interesting because you see how...
Well, that's what the title is, right? It's about the coffee.
The Big Heat. Yeah. It's, yes. I believe that's yes, I believe you're correct about that. It was,
the Big Bean.
Well, and then they were going to go for the Folgers in your cup is the best part of waking up. But then they realized it was too long and Folgers didn't exist at the time. So...
True. Yeah, and they hadn't quite got... they didn't exist at the time because they didn't come into existence until they started running ads featuring incest.
Oh, are they the ones?
That was one correction I wanted to make, because I said it was the Sears...
Son of a gun.
AC ad.
Yes.
But it wasn't. It was the Folgers incest ad that I was thinking of.
I gotta see this. You gotta
from the last episode.
Yes. I gotta track this. We gotta see this.
I will send it to you.
Well, I would love to see it. And it's like, but I mean, like you were saying about the commissioner stands up and he's like, well, maybe we should call it a night. And it's like, you see, now we know what the power dynamic is in name. He's the commissioner, but he's not in charge of fuck all, and I mean, he's the one who has to take her to the hospital because we can't take her because we're criminals. You're going to go. And it's like, he doesn't even argue. I mean, it's interesting. I was telling you about Colin MacArthur's book, The Big Heat, and he was talking about the Selma Parker character, the gal at the Victory Auto Wreckers, and she's got a limp. She's obviously got, I don't know if it was polio or what, but Colin MacArthur was saying that when the script was first written, it's very possible that the writer was using what was at the time a pretty common trope in Hollywood movies where people with physical disabilities were considered malevolent. Which, I mean, is just so weird. It's like, wow, kick them while they're down, why don't you? But apparently that was a very common shorthand where they'd be like, oh, he's got a hunch or something, so he's bad. And in this case, Lang, basically without changing a line of dialogue, turned it around. At least this is what Colin MacArthur thinks. He turned it around and made her this incredibly basically humane human being who goes out on a limb for him. And then he says,
and her limbs don't always work.
well, true. She's going out. Oh, God damn it, man.
Don't worry. Projexploitation is safe from getting canceled because this is Sex and the City. Thank you, Dan. Continue.
That's true. Right. We're totally, yes, we are quarantined from it. Yes. But the way it's, what was I saying? Oh, the way the scenes filmed, where you see them on opposite sides of a chain link fence. And Callum MacArthur's talking about like how, oh, well, it's like they're imprisoned, and she's, and her disability, it's almost like, as he say here, suggestive of the imprisonment of a basically humane person working for an indifferent employer, and perhaps more generally of a representative of the citizenry under Lagana. So it's almost like the whole citizenry feels this crush from the corruption. They all, so again, maybe that's part of the reason why she wants to help, other than that she probably feels bad for the guy because his wife got blown up for no reason.
I totally agree. In fact, I think that's probably a good segue into maybe taking a little intermission. Mm-hmm. And when we come back, talking about the cast at large, I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm sure you do as well, particularly about Glenn Ford. So why don't we put a pin in it there, and we'll see you on the other side. Don't touch that dial.
The dial. No, I'm kidding.
Sleeping beauties, it's time to wake up. We're back here with a little Sex in the City for you. But before this dream interview, we were talking about Fritz Lang's The Big Heat. And you know what? There's another man at the center of all this. And his name is Glenn Ford, the creator of the automobile.
Little known fact, yes.
Yeah.
He was Henry Ford's other son after Edsel. Yeah.
Yes, he was the one who wasn't a Nazi.
Sadly true. And if you ever want me to go on for hours about American companies collaborating with the Nazis, I would be happy to do that. And I don't think anyone else would be happy, though. So,
oh, man. Tiny tangent, because I mentioned to you repeatedly that I really want you to watch it. But I don't know what the novel did, but the David Simon adaptation of The Plot Against America goes after Ford in a big way. He's a minor character, but it makes no qualms about his place. Even in alternate history, it's not like it's like, oh, this is what if. Like, no. This what if is only kowtowing to who he actually was.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's, I think, one of only 3 Americans who received, like, this incredibly high honor from the Nazis. Like, Hitler sent him a personal note, like him, Lindbergh, and I want to say Teagle, but I might be wrong. I don't know. But yeah, it's pretty damning. I mean, the anti-Semitism is woo doggy.
Yes. So we're not here to talk about anti-Semitism, not tonight at least. Well, we'll save that for another night. We are here to talk about The Big Heat and specifically the casting. So we'll start at the top of this mountain. The Big Heat himself, the titular Big Heat, Dave Banyan, played by Glenn Ford. So, Dan, I'm going to light a little fuse here. Put it out if you think it's too hot. But
okay.
I'm going to say that I think Glenn Ford is genuinely an amazing and charismatic presence to watch in any film that he's in. I very much enjoy his roles and his work. But I also don't think he's one of the great actors.
Sure.
In fact, I think he's one of somewhat limited range. And I think that's what makes the Big Heat work on screen very well, is that I think this is a case of good casting over good performance. Because, especially in film noir, you almost always need someone who's just able to ooze out of their pores, when hard-boiledness. And Glenn Ford just can't. He just looks like a doughboy. He looks like everybody's best friend's dad.
It's true.
Just a swell person. So this whole hate binge that he goes on is very out of his range and out of his character, I think, as an actor, that I actually think it makes it that much more potent, because he's just posturing the whole time. This is very much not him and not really something that he's good at, so to speak. And he pays the price for that repeatedly. He literally gets people killed. So I don't know if you thought that, if you're the opposite, if you just think that no, he's a great actor and this movie works because of his performance, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts about either his performance or just the casting of him in general?
Well, boy, it's really some good questions there. I would say I like Glenn Ford. He's likable. And I think, like you said, for instance, he's so good in the domestic scenes with Jocelyn Brando, who, by the way, is fantastic. I don't know why she wasn't in more things. And I think I've seen like maybe 2 other movies she was in, which both had Marlon Brando in them. Anyway, but she was so good. I love their patter. It seems very affectionate. But once Glenn Ford goes on the hate binge, though, you're right. It does feel like this 5-foot tall guy in a 10-foot suit or something, Not to say that I don't believe him when he's able to slug the shit out of somebody, or when he's grabbing, he's always calling everybody thief. He's like, yeah, thief.
It's very weird vernacular.
It's very strange.
Because that's what I also mean, is that it's like he's a foreigner in this soil, because he's trying to do the speak and the walk and the talk, and it doesn't look natural on him because he doesn't even get it right. And I say that as a strength of the movie and the character.
That's really interesting. I had not really thought about it in these terms before. I mean, I thought at best he does a good job, but I mean, it's tough because there's other people in this film who shine so bright. And I think it's almost the consensus that Glenn Ford turns in a workmanlike performance, and it's good. It's not, I mean, it doesn't detract at all, but it's not what makes the film a great film. Originally I think Fritz Lang said he wanted, George Raft, who was a pretty big guy and actually pretty mobbed up too, actually. And I think he also talked about Edward G. Robinson, and I think he might have been a little too old, though, for the role by that point. But like I said, in the novel, he's a big dude. You almost imagine somebody like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of somebody right now who's pretty tall and humongous.
The Rock.
Yeah, I was thinking somebody a little more suburban, I guess, but not like John Cena or whatever. But, I don't know, Jason Segel, maybe, he's pretty tall, right?
Yeah, I get it. Kind of oversized, but still an average guy.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's a good performance, overall, but I think you're right. It's like he's wearing a suit of clothes that doesn't fit him. And I think maybe that's to his credit, to the character's credit, because he does, like I said, he keeps bouncing back from almost going over the edge and, and becoming something he doesn't want to be. Yeah,
no, I completely agree. And it's not so much that he doesn't play bad guys. I mean, he gives a great performance in 3:10 to Yuma.
That's right.
Psychologically speaking, as the quote-unquote criminal in that movie.
Forgot about that.
Really, by the end of that movie, it's not so much that, you root for one over the other, but obviously a lot of is stripped down. And the two men, obviously, you find out that they have a lot more in common spiritually than they realize. But he's still convincing in that role, so it's not so much that he's beneath or above any of this kind of stuff. But there's something about this particular one man takes on an army that seems out of its depth in very practical ways. And so therefore, it makes a ton of sense that he's kind of screwing it up as he goes along. I mean, he is indirectly responsible for the deaths of a lot of the females of this movie, let alone the direct, reason for possible deaths and or at least serious bodily harm of some of the hard-nosed, criminals and whatnot. But the other thing, and kind of moving away a little bit from Glenn Ford and getting on to some of the others, but I also want to mention the performance of Lee Marvin as Vince Stone.
Oh, yeah.
Lee Marvin in general is always great, but, it takes a special kind of performance, I think, to outshine the big bad, because, Lagana obviously is the person at the top, and he's the... nothing happened without his say-so, but the real actual catalyst of sheer incarnate evil in this movie is Vince Stone's character. He's got the most notorious scene of violence with the coffee. And of course, his comeuppance is a direct echo of what he did to Debbie, but is the most satisfying of all of the scenes. It's the one time where the film's revenge is not as sour as the rest, because she didn't really go after anything that he didn't already take from her. It wasn't you did this to me, so therefore I'm going to ruin your life. It was kind of like, you can't just go around doing this, so here, now you're going to go around looking like the victims of what you do. It's a very theatrical comeuppance, both in the poetic justice of it being the literal act of what he did, but also as being this quite literal signifier for him to have to go out in public now with this cross to bear. Because unlike Debbie, I think she's going to be okay, because she's always been somebody who's I wouldn't say maybe looked down on herself, but didn't think much of herself, and that's why she was in these situations. Whereas, someone like Vince thought he was on top of the world. So the pain that kind of act would cause, and not just physical but mental, is so much worse in his case than it will end up being for Debbie. Now, that, of course, is putting aside the fact that she dies. But yeah, just in that exchange of blows. What do you think of Lee Marvin as Vince Stone?
I think he's fantastic. I like Lee Marvin a lot. In fact, a couple of my favorite movies from the 60s, he's the lead in. It's a movie called The Killers, in which he has one of the coolest death scenes ever. I mean, spoiler alert, I guess it's the very end. But he does this fall where he topples onto his face in this front lawn in the middle of the day. And it's like, I don't know how he did the fall, but it's incredible. I'm like, damn, that's one of the great falls in movies. And then he was also in Point Blank, which is one of the greatest revengers ever, which is interesting because he doesn't end up visiting any violence upon the people. His presence forces them to screw up, and they end up killing themselves somehow or wounding themselves over and over again. So there's this odd humor to it, but he's also this incredibly single-minded guy, like to the point where you're like, is he even real? Is he like a wraith from beyond? Because like, did he really survive all that times he got shot? I don't know. Well, anyway, Point Blank is just a Stone classic. But anyway, I love Lee Marvin in this. I like his exchanges with Lagana. The stuff where he's talking to him, he's like, "Well, should I take care of Banyan for?" And he's like, "You worry me, Vince." It's like he's like, "You haven't learned anything yet. I'm trying to teach you how to play the long game as a gangster." And there's another part where Larry Gordon and him are talking to Lagana, and Vince Stone's like, if she keeps drinking, I'll just throw her to the curb. She doesn't have any claim on me. And Larry Gordon's like, throw her my way. I'm a rebound man from way back. And Lagana's like, I don't like your filthy mouth. And there's a cut. There's just a switch, just quick cut to Lee Marvin. And he's looking over to Larry and he's like, he's got a cigar. He's like, just don't say anything else, because you will regret it if you don't. Just you're going to learn. This is what you do in this situation. So there's a lot of like little grace notes like that. But I think he's absolutely superb, and he's evil in a thoughtless way, which I think is probably how most violent people are. I don't think there's a great deal of foreplanning or, you know what I mean?
It's very id driven. It's just pure id.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotta have id.
Gotta have id, man. Kicking and screaming again.
Now they're kicking and screaming reference.
So good. Old Man River. But I love Lee Marvin in this a lot. And of course, I mean, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little about Gloria Graham, who is...
I do mind.
Okay, well then, you're just going to have to take it, because it's happening, man. It is happening now.
Okay.
But she's one of my all-time Hollywood crushes. And she always, every role she's in, she has a very magnetic sexuality, but it's got this elusive quality too. And I almost would describe it as attractiveness. So it's like, how like sometimes, people who aren't whatever conventionally handsome or beautiful, but yet they're attractive. Now she's very conventionally beautiful, but she has these characteristics that I think have always kind of separated her from a lot of the ingenues that were her age that were competing for roles with her in Hollywood at the time. She plays these characters who are like impulsive, but they seem to be almost viewing the events sometimes from like a certain remove. I almost imagine she's got this thing running in the back of her head, like, well, it's good to keep a sense of humor about these things, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I found out apparently Columbia Pictures actually wanted Marilyn Monroe for this role, and she was contracted for another place, and they couldn't negotiate it, so they went with Gloria Graham. And I'm sure Marilyn Monroe would have done a good job, but Gloria Graham was a much more accomplished actor at that point. I mean, Marilyn Monroe really came into her own in the late 50s, early 60s.
I was going to say, that was pretty early for Monroe as far as actual notoriety.
Oh, yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Gloria Graham had already won an Oscar and been nominated also prior to that. There's just a lot of subtle notes that Gloria Graham brings to it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, In a Lonely Place was only, 2 or 3 years prior to this, and that's one of the all-time greats.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I love her so much in that. And I've probably said this to you a million times, but I mean, it's got like maybe the saddest ending lines in the history of cinema, where she's like, oh, yesterday that would have meant so much, but now it doesn't mean anything. And it's like, just crushes you. And oh God, it's so good.
Mm-hmm.
But, and again, some of it has to do with her performance too, just the way she delivers those lines. Truffaut has a line here in his review. He says, she's always had a certain high strung tension, and in this film, she's absolutely perfect. And, another person here said she has a feigned obliviousness and highly evolved variations on her patented scatterbrain misdirection. I think that's really true. She has this kind of feeling like she's viewing things, like I said, from a certain remove, but at the same time, she's also like, I'm trying to be a little bit of a holy fool here and pretend not to understand too much, because it'll get me into trouble and I'll get beaten up or worse, And honestly, I don't know if you feel this, but I think, and this could just have to do with my own obsessions, frankly, but if I could think of another performance other than other Gloria Graham performances that reminds me of her in this movie, I would say it's Elizabeth Shue in this movie from 1998. It's like this kind of sun-bleached noir called Palmetto. She has like Elizabeth Shue. Well, first of all, the movie's like, you can see the humidity just coming off the road and off the walls. And she has this like blissed out, concupiscence, I guess, where, and she has this pretense of incomprehension. And it's like between the humidity and it's like she's just barely, she seems to be just barely paying attention. And some of it might have to do with the humidity, just like exhausting everyone. And also the fact that she's extremely wealthy. And so nothing matters to her very much. She's like Southern gentry, And also she has this way of walking super slow. It's like it's going to take her a week just to get across the room. And she radiates like some seriously sexy suggestiveness. I mean, and again, it's like she looks semi-exhausted, like she's trying to take the trouble if she's going to decide to seduce you or not, But it's one of the sexiest performances in movies, and she keeps her clothes on for the whole thing too. So much like Gloria Graham, it's all in the suggestiveness and not in the other goods. So.
Well, this reminds me of one thing, which I was looking over Gloria Graham's credits, and I had no idea that I had actually seen a late career performance of hers that I did not. I forgot it was her, basically.
Oh, really? Which
will kind of tie it into our mothership, Projexploitation. But she plays, basically, she plays Mama in Mama's Dirty Girls, which is a film from 1974. And it's a great little sexplo where Mama has 3 very, very horny nymphs that she's essentially trained to seduce men so that they can murder them and get their money and run off to another another place. But she's Mama in that equation, and it's one of the grimiest sexploits I've ever seen. Post the Roughies, because it's in color and it's past that era of what like Doris Wishman, Bad Girls Go to Hell, but it's in this way more seedy, like porn was coming into its own, so therefore it was allowed to do a lot more things, even if it wasn't quite pornographic. And it's a great little sexplo. But the reason why I bring it up is just because I totally forgot that Gloria Graham, and this is 1974, was the matriarch in that movie, and she did a great job in it. It's exactly. It didn't look like she was slumming it. I'm sure other people may think that, but I think it takes someone special to kind of effortlessly slide into those kind of pictures, even if it's by circumstance. I'm not saying she maybe didn't, want to do more than that or something like that, but she didn't just cash it.
I did not know about that at all. There's a quote from like the year The Big Heat came out, and it was just one of those Hollywood mags, and she said this really interesting thing, like, oh, well, they ought to call me Mrs. Obituary for 1953 or whatever year, because she's like, I love the ones where I'm really getting smacked around. She's like, the Mickey Spillane type stuff. She's like, it's not because I'm a masochist. It's just those are the scenes the audiences remember, those really visceral scenes. So she definitely liked to play to the edge. I mean, she danced near the edge of the razor quite a bit, at least as far as they could at the time.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I did not know about that film.
Yeah. And that would have been one of her final performances, because it looks like, unfortunately, she was diagnosed with breast cancer in that year.
Yes.
So she didn't live much past that. It looks like 81 is when she passed away. So, but good on her for quite the illustrious career. I mean, you have some of the greatest films of all time early on, and yet she also, I think, did some very fun performances in her later years that I would not take away from her one bit.
Well, I always forget that she's in It's a Wonderful Life until I'm watching it again every year or every other year, and I'm like, son of a gun, that's Gloria Graham. That's true of a lot of those movies where like these certain people keep just showing up everywhere, like that like group of 30 or 40 character actors. You're like, oh man, it's that guy again or that gal again. They're so good,
I feel like even though I intrinsically know that Cary Grant is like one of the most famous actors, of all time, I still always go, oh, this is a Cary Grant movie, to about like any movie he made, I don't know, maybe before the 40s or something,
Sure.
Like, I've seen stuff that he was in, obviously, from the 30s, especially some of the more screwball stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But I forget just how many movies he was in. He was like a workhorse before he just became an actual, like, natural-born star.
It's amazing how hard some of these actors worked. Like, I was reading that Lee Marvin, when he was making this movie, I don't know if he was like shooting during the day on one set and shooting at night on another, but he was shooting the Wild one, the Brando movie, the motorcycle gang one.
Yeah.
He was shooting that at the time too. He was one of the Beatles. That was the name of the biker gang. And was
he Ringo?
Well, actually, I mean, in truth, the Beatles did say they got part of their idea from that, although it wasn't BEAT, so that was their invention. But,
did they really say that?
Oh, yeah, it's true. Yo, they love Brando.
Huh.
Yeah.
I thought maybe this was one of those dumb internet things. I always thought that their thing was from Buddy Holly.
Oh, the Crickets. Well, they loved, They loved Buddy Holly and the Crickets.
Like if they were the Crickets and they're the Beatles type thing.
Well, they used to be called Johnny and the Moondogs, believe it or not, like way back.
I don't believe it.
It's bizarre. I know. I don't blame you for not believing it because it sounds like I just made it up. Like, yeah, they were the glowworms for a time, and then they were the Tamsmen anyway. Sorry.
Okay, just to really quickly, sorry.
Yes.
I just want to point out, because I just confirmed, in the 30s alone, from 32 to 39, Cary Grant was in 34 movies, which seems like a lot.
Holy cow.
So, anyway,
wow. Well, what was the time period again?
From 32, because that was his first role, was in 32, all the way through the end of 39. And it wasn't until about 38, I would say, when he started to star in like classics, because 38 is Bringing Up Baby, and then followed that with Holiday, Only Angels Have Wings, His Girl Friday, and so on.
Oh, okay.
But throughout that entire period where he was gaining notoriety, he was still he hadn't been in any of those classics until the end of that decade, and he was in about 30 plus, movies. That's pretty crazy for that era.
Well, I didn't know there was that many. That's incredible.
Yeah, that's why I'm always when I see TCM and I'm like, oh, it's a Cary Grant film. And I'm like, never heard of this. Oh, it's from the 30s when he was this whippersnapper.
That's great. Huh. Well, yeah, I would like to talk a little about, Roger Ebert has a very relatively well-known theory about his opinion about what The Big Heat is about, which he thinks is one of the great films, by the way. It's in his book, The Great Movies, Volume 2. And he has a very, I would say a pretty famous interpretation, in which he feels it's working simultaneously on two levels, right? So level 2 is brought across not from the screenplay, but just from Lang's choice of lighting and framing and editing. And so, his theory goes that in the same way that Banyan is basically living two discrete lives at the beginning, one is the cop who's, he's in the shit. And, the one is the husband. The movie operates on two levels. And the first level is dark, definitely, because it's a film noir, but with a hero whose motivations are pretty comprehensible and pretty sympathetic. The poles between good and bad are pretty clear. Now, Ebert says there's a second level, which is like pitch black and very discomforting, frankly, to read about. And here's a quote. He says, Banyan's buried agenda is to set up the women, allow their deaths to confirm his hatred of the Lagana Stone crew, and then wade in to get his revenge. Of course, he doesn't understand this. He invites evil into the lives of his wife and two other women by his self-righteous heroism. So in other words, Banyan is like the inversion of the noir trope of the femme fatale. In this case, all the women he meets are killed or placed in jeopardy, while he doesn't, not a glove nor a bullet ever touches this dude. I mean, he comes away totally unscathed. Now, I think it's an interesting interpretation, and I think Ebert, being a brilliant writer and a brilliant man, he does argue it very convincingly. But I don't necessarily see it myself, unless it would be, I think it would have to be so far into the unconscious of Banyan that which maybe is Ebert's point, but I feel there's another level. I feel there's a third level that doesn't appear until the third act. And that's when it's detectable. And that I find even more worrisome. Okay. So this is how it breaks down. Okay. And I know you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, and I wasn't able to quite, I'm still having trouble finding the words exactly, but okay. So the trouble is, at the end, the mechanism that brings about the fall of the whole criminal enterprise is the killing that is perpetrated by Debbie, right? Banyan wants it to happen, but he refuses, he steps back. So Debbie, who's the supposedly morally compromised consort, gun mug of gangsters, so she does it for him. So what am I to understand? I mean, what does this say as us in the audience? What are we to basically understand? Is it that, well, she's already a criminal and she's damaged goods, so why not have her sell herself further so that the audience, can have a resolution that we crave? Because we want it. This is really Banyan and us in the audience having our cake and eating it too. And I'll say this, but I'll preface it with this. The widow Duncan, Bertha Duncan, is a truly loathsome character. When Banyan is like getting ready to strangle her, it's terrible for me to say this, but I'm like mostly on the way there with him. I'm like, yeah, maybe she needs some killing, it's terrible to say that, but I feel that. And in fact, even in the novel, she's even worse. She talks about the delight she felt when she heard that her husband's mistress was tortured and murdered, and how great she felt about keeping her husband's last dying wish from coming, she's bad news. But the fact that Debbie pulls the trigger, I don't think that lets Banyan, or more importantly, us, off the hook, our desires. Because we want it to happen, and I think we're morally implicated, regardless of whether or not it happens under other indirect circumstances. Okay, so the maybe the chief problem that I always have in the Big Heat, and I think this is intentional on the part of Lang, I might be wrong. I think this is a moral problem that he intentionally places in there, maybe so we don't feel too safe and smug about how everything turns out. Because, okay, yeah, Debbie's revenging for her own sake too, but she's also kind of doing it because Banyan's been a stand-up guy for her. And let's do a thought experiment, right? And imagine for a second that she didn't kill Bertha Duncan, right? So what that means is Banyan he just would have had to keep going. He's just toiling away, collecting information and hearsay. And let's face it, the mobsters might have never been brought to justice. So it's not a deus ex machina per se, because the machina, the deliverance function, it occurs in something that's strongly rooted in like the first scene. The plot is right in it. So it's not like something swoops in and to save the day, but the resolution kind of lulls us into thinking that we have got clean hands and Banyan has got clean hands. It's like a Blondie ex machina. It's a Debbie ex machina. It's a Debbie ex machina. Wow. Boom. That's why I get the money. That's why but but do you see what I mean? It's frustrating to me because I feel that I'm morally implicated too. It's like we get this cheat. You know what I mean? Like, well, we get to have this thing, but we didn't do it. So it just, out of a happy turn of events, it all worked out. And it's like, I don't know. I find it very disturbing. And that's about the best way I've been able to explain it so far.
I completely agree, actually. And that's kind of what I alluded to, but got sidetracked earlier when I got hung up on the cops coming around. But that was the other point I wanted to make.
Oh, yeah.
The ending is a little too pat. Not as far as plot goes, because I'm less concerned with that, but with the idea that, yeah, this is essentially taken out of Dave Banyan's hands.
Right.
It really doesn't drive home the hate binge part, because he only comes to a stop because he's allowed to, you know?
Yeah.
When he chooses not to kill Vince, at that point, he's gotten everything he does technically need and wanted.
Totally.
It's not like there are loose ends. And he had been saying up until that point that this is all he wanted, with that while he says he was going to kill him, like I had said earlier, it was kind of more posturing, you know, in his performance, a little more bravado, misplaced and whatnot. So I agree that there's a slightly more morally interesting film nestled within this one if they actually had him have to make that choice, but instead Debbie does it for him. And I give the film credit for essentially at least understanding the weight of her sacrifice, because it's not like it casts her aside after her death. Like pretty much the final scene, well, before the literal final scene, but the final scene in the penthouse is mostly concerned with Debbie's dying breaths and, you know, her happiness, you know, fleeting as it is, as they kind of exchange a little bit more. And it's kind of interesting that her last act on Earth is almost trying to get him to remember what used to, you know, give him his humanity, i.e. the memory of his lost wife. And she's really a morally good person. Like, she does a reprehensible thing, but she almost does it out of a sacrificial light, essentially. Basically saying, it almost comes from a place of self-loathing, like, I've got nothing and I am nothing, so I can do this, so right. You know, you don't have to. And if anything, unfortunately, not that I condone murder, but that is a selfless act in a lot of ways, particularly when, you have a character like Dave Banyan, who is supposed to be the tough guy and is supposed to, get things done. So I find that whole character fascinating, and I do think the movie does do right by her. But, and maybe there's something to be said that Dave Banyan can't really get anything done. He just gets people killed. Debbie's the one who has to she kills Bertha, and then obviously starts it with Vin Stone, and Wilkes comes around, after the guards are pulled, and essentially allows Banyan to walk away from most of his crime scenes. Yeah. Banyan doesn't really do anything smart in this movie. He's kind of the worst, dumbest cop and as he should be. He's acting on emotion, not on logic. Sure. But it's astounding that when you were talking earlier that he's able to do this because of other people, that's like underselling it. He's not able to do shit. It's really a bunch of other people allowing him to process his trauma as they, clean up his shit or sometimes suffer the consequences of it. So, nice. But I think Debbie's a great character for sure.
I like her a lot too, and it was kind of what you said earlier about how she seems to have kind of a low opinion of herself in a way, which is kind of how she keeps falling in with these guys. And so for her, it's like, this is a far greater thing than I've ever, that kind of thing where she can do that. And it's great, but it feels, again, like I wonder if Fritz Lang is telling us, well, don't get too comfortable because you guys wanted it. We all wanted it. And we got to get it without our precious hero being sullied, if you will. Instead, the gangster's girl did it for us. And I think it might be intentional. I find it extremely disturbing. You'll see it sometimes in other films, but it's very rarely do you see it so clearly portrayed as in this movie. And it's really thorny. You know? Well,
usually in film noir, this is actually a common thing, but it's always played up in a very seductive way, because this is almost the weird bastardization of the femme fatale trope, right. Where instead of it looking good on this woman, it's really just a really uncomfortable line that she should never have had to cross, particularly after what she had suffered throughout the whole picture.
No, exactly. I mean, she's already been through so much, and it's like she's trying to clean up her life, obviously. I mean, it's a weird thing, and I guess I've said all the words I can about it, but it continues to bother me. Yeah. Which I guess maybe one of the reasons why I really love the film is that I keep thinking about that stuff all the time.
Oh yeah. Well, before we go into final rating, did you have some final comments you wanted to make of a particular nature?
Well, it has to do with B movies and A movies.
Yeah.
Because this came out in 1953 from Columbia Pictures,
yeah,
and
this was a B movie because it's the big heat, not the A heat.
Right? Because if it was called the Asphalt Jungle, it would be an A movie.
Correct. Yep.
Boom. So no. But anyway, Colin McCarthy talks about how American domestic box office had been going down the tubes ever since, well, first the Depression, and then after World War II, people just did not have the money. Basically, there were only two studios that were able to sustain profits and even grow. One was MGM because they were just so humongous, and the other was Columbia because they concentrated, on a lot of those low-budget movies, a lot of quickies. Yeah. And they developed what Colin McCarthy calls a cheese-pairing corporate ethos for which it never lost its reputation. And cheese pairing apparently is a UK idiom. Colin McCarthy's from the UK. But it means that it's actions that highlight one's unwillingness or reluctance to spend money. So it kind of makes sense. Glenn Kenny in the liner notes for the Indicator version of Big Heat says that Columbia was a studio that liked its artistic statements on tightly held budgetary leashes. I mean, like, for instance, there's a song in this movie called Put the Blame on Mame, and that song's featured in another Columbia movie with Glenn Ford called Gilda from a few years earlier, Rita Hayworth. And then a few years later, in 1958, that song appears a third time in a Columbia Pictures. I mean, they wrung every last little bit out of every property they had. They were going to get their money's worth. So that kind of gives you an idea of Columbia. And so the other thing, too, is that Columbia had just bought the rights to this really, really big time novel by James Jones called From Here to Eternity. It's all about the beginning of World War II. And they had this humongous shooting schedule that went on for months. They had a huge budget. Everything, like their pre-publicity machine went into the works to kind of tell everybody, hey, we got this movie coming. And in the end, it works. I mean, they won a bunch of Oscars, and it's still a pretty well-regarded movie. But the big heat and pretty much everything else was considered the B movies. So From Here to Eternity was the 1A movie of 1953, and goddamn it, they were going to push this thing through. They were going to get the big act. Yeah, they got Burt Lancaster and Frank Sinatra and, you know, I mean, all that. And so you compare that with the Big Heat where, okay, so the Big Heat, basically they bought the rights to the book on, okay, according to Colin McCarthy, they bought the rights on January 12th, 1953. And then shooting began April 15th. Okay. And so if the book was purchased on January 12th and shooting was completed on April 15th. So so shooting began on March 17th, that means the screenwriter had to have been hired, have drafted by January 20th a version, and then redrafted and had the script approved all within 2 months. And then they shot it and got it done. And then they didn't even bother to release it till October because they had bigger fish to fry with this From Here to Eternity thing. I mean, it's crazy, right? But it shows you how, like, even a movie like The Big Heat, which was technically it was a two picture thing. You know, it was technically the A movie, and then there was a B movie that was shown with it. But technically, they were both kind of the B movies. You know what I mean? Like, they were the ones where it was like, yeah, let's get some profit into here. And it's just interesting to see a place like Columbia Pictures where they did just kind of get every little bit out of everything they could. And, apparently Fritz Lang was able to get that stuff for him in a timely way and keep it under budget. But anyway, at the time, it was not considered a very prestige movie. It got some reviews. Most people are like, oh, it's got that violent scene with the coffee. And then that was kind of it for a long time. Other than like Francois Truffaut and a couple of these French guys who loved it, it was kind of considered just, I don't want to say trash, but just kind of a B movie, I guess.
Yeah.
And now it's hugely regarded.
Oh, yeah, and I definitely have read about its kind of resurgence, not recently, I mean, it's happened over time.
Sure.
But that, the critical acclaim that it totally deserves and gets pretty much today was not instantaneous. It was kind of a build-up for sure. And honestly, film noir is a precursor, I would say, to exploitation in general. Like, it's not the exact same kind of ethos, so to speak, because I don't think film noir, while it was pulpy and certainly had promises of a dark and seedy world, it was less, I think, concerned with the content as it was with the visuals and certainly the mood. Mm-hmm. So, but its roots being in those novels and pulp stories and whatnot certainly is. You could draw a line from that to the emergence of exploitation pictures of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because pretty much film noir died out just before those movies started to exist. So, the absence of one created a hole for the other to fill, for sure. So they're definitely related.
Yeah, like you said, I feel like there is a line you can draw. And of course, a lot of it comes down to technology, too. Like, things got a little cheaper. Like, for instance, so many exploitation films, they shoot on location outside. They didn't have sets. Yeah. And that was true of a lot of the film noirs, where it was like, okay, we're going to film outside. And it essentially became part of its own aesthetic, was just out of necessity.
Yeah. So, all right, let's go into final ratings. I'm going to go first, and then I'm going to hand it off to you. I think this movie is fantastic. It's probably my favorite film noir. I haven't seen a lot, so I definitely want to see more to really broaden that horizon, but it's really tough to beat. And most of that really comes down to Fritz Lang's direction. I mean, I think he really takes that kind of domestic tranquility to task in this very insidious plot, as one man essentially tries to pretend that it's not as bad as it is, and it's much worse than he feared. And I think it's fantastic all the way through. I mean, I have some qualms a little bit with the last 10 to 20 minutes because of the moral ramifications that are not quite probed, and maybe due to some of the turnarounds on the characters. But by and large, in general, when it matters, it's gold, and it's so good at what it does. And I could watch this repeatedly for sure. So for me, it's 4.5 out of 5. It's probably never going to be in my personal canon, but I also can't think of anything this movie does wrong. I think it's just a dynamite picture. And let me just say how amazing the final line of this movie is, considering it's not underscored. You know, like, the end has almost already cropped up on, which is actually a very unique ending, because the end just kind of fades in as the picture is still going with action in the foreground. And usually movies of this time want more of a, cut, not necessarily cut to, but either like the action has completely come to a standstill, or we've turned the mic off of what we're watching, so therefore we can focus on the swelling. But here it's like the hustle and the bustle of that final scene in the squad room is actually still front and center, even when the movie is essentially ending and the end crops up. But for the final line, which does not get an underline of him saying, "Keep the coffee hot, Hugo," is just one of the sickest jokes you can make at the end of this movie, and I absolutely love it. It's so good. So, yeah, 4.5 out of 5 for me.
I agree with you, though. Most movies of the time, they would kind of they put a button on the end. It wasn't just like it faded out, like while he's walking out the door, and there's a little poster back there that says, "Give blood," I mean, it is kind of an unusual ending. Like I said, Colin MacArthur says, "Oh, it's just like the nightmare starts again. It's just a cycle." Yeah. So for him, he thinks it's a super bleak ending where it's like, "All right, keep the coffee hot, Hugo, because we're going to be seeing more horrible shit." As for me, it's just so tightly made, and it's probably one of my favorite movies in which I'm not a huge fan of the lead character. The lead actor, I should say. Yeah. He does everything right, but it's usually I have a more passionate feeling towards the lead actor in a movie that I love this much. But it's just one of those rare exceptions where I think he does a very good job and he quits himself fine. But it's really the film itself, and again, some of the other supporting, like Gloria Graham, Lee Marvin, those guys, that really help just raise this thing up. So I give it 5 stars.
Oh, yeah. So that is Saxon City's presentation of The Big Heat. But got a little solo for you following that, and it's time for us to sing the opening notes of The A-List. Did you drink in those notes? I know I sure did.
Oh, I imbibed deeply.
We here at Sex and the City are taking a cue from our mother, Projexploitation, and we're doing a segment we like to call the A-List. And if you don't know what the A-List is now, let's rap a little bit and we'll explain it. You see, normally in Projexploitation, we're talking about what we call B-movies, rough and tumble picks of that era. And what we like to do is pair it up with a more either well-known or critically acclaimed film. That's why we call it the A-List, because it's the A-List of this B-picture. Now, obviously, here in Sex and the City, the notes are a little different, baby. You can't always see where this one's going to go. So while we may not be talking about a quote-unquote unknown movie like The Big Heat, we're still going to try to pair it with something. So I think this is probably even more open-ended than normal. But what say you, Dan? What would you pick as your A-list choice?
Well, it kind of came to me in a flash. I was watching, I've probably seen Big Heat like 5 or 6 times now. I mean, I've seen it 3 times just recently. And you know how I like to ship from my main man, Tony Scott. So there's this very deliberate matter of factness where Banyan's leaving the commissioner's office and they're like, what are you going to do? And he's like, I'm going to kill the people responsible for my wife's murder. And it's so pithy and he just leaves right afterwards. It reminded me of Tony Scott's Man on Fire, 2004, Denzel Washington.
Oh, yeah.
The Creasy Bear. Creasy. Yep. The Creasy Bear's art is murder and he's about to do his best. No, I'm sorry. That's a terrible walking impression. Anyway, but there's a part where they think Dakota Fanning, Lupita has been killed. And so Lupita's mom, I think her name's Rika, is talking to Creasy, and she's like, so what are you going to do? And Creasy's like, what I do best, I'm going to kill them. And he said, anyone that was involved, anybody who profited from it, anybody who opens their eyes at me. And he does just that. And it is an incredibly satisfying revenger, even though he goes a little overboard and it's a just so story that makes it so that he's justified. But it's just such a damn good movie, and it gets more and more unhinged as it goes. The graphics get weirder. The subtitles start to like fly off the screen sometimes, or it's just really, really bizarre. It shows Tony Scott, I think, at a really exciting moment in his artistic development. When I include this in like Domino, Deja Vu, and those movies around that time, I feel like he was just like, screw it. What do I have to lose now? I've already done my Hollywood movies. I'm going to do it in the way that I've never seen it done before. And I think that's just what makes Man on Fire such a great movie. So Tony Scott's Man on Fire.
Hell yeah. I have not seen that in a while. I watched it when it first came out, and I was probably like 13 or 14. So as a youngin', that was a very cool R-rated movie to watch, because there was some pretty extreme bouts of violence in there.
Hell yes.
Yeah, I remember, even if I kind of think back on it, are actually pretty graphic for Tony Scott. Like, True. He was always making like R-rated fare, but there's some torture scenes in there that are pretty gruesome in a gnarly way. So that's a great choice.
Thank you.
I am going to pair The Big Heat with a little film from 1997. Directed by James Mangold. I'm talking about the movie Copland.
Oh, nice.
First of all, I just think it's underrated, which I know is kind of a meaningless word these days, but in general.
No, but you're right.
We don't talk about that movie enough, I think, because I think it's fantastic. And while there's really nothing to do with the mob, it's certainly obviously a story in which one cop is being told not to pursue something, and can't really, follow that directive. And, it's got different outcomes, from this movie to that movie. But it's really about generally decent men who are just fed up with the way that the police system has been co-opted by other influences and other agendas and whatnot. And, even Sylvester Stallone, who I don't think is a good actor. I mean, not that I even think that that's like controversial, but like even something like Rocky, I'm like, you're technically playing a person who's gotten punched so many times that I guess I believe that this performance, whatever, but even that, whatever.
Yeah.
But in Copland, I think that's the finest performance he's ever given, where he's actually trying and he's not playing himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does come down to that too, because he has to stand tall against all these charismatic actors, opposite of him, whether it's Harvey Keitel or Robert De Niro. And honestly, that whole movie really does thread the line very well. I mean, it's funny because people call it a neo-noir, but it's really a neo-noir Western because, he is literally a sheriff. And, I think the last scene, I believe, not the last scene, but the climax, is quite literally him kind of walking into a mob, the same way that you would back in the Old West, when you come to address the community, not just the villain, and how it's a very public display of repudiation. So for me, I think Copland is a fantastic movie that doesn't get quite enough love, but also is would be a nice counterpiece, I think, to The Big Heat. They're not like similar films where they would be mistaken for one another, or remakes of or whatever, but they share enough in common that I think that would be an interesting double billing.
That sounds killer. I would love that. Well, it's funny in a way. Sylvester Stallone's Freddy character is a guy who's been looking the other way his whole life. And finally, he's just like, nope. And yeah, that final gunfight, for lack of a better word. I mean, you mentioned it's kind of a Western of him trudging up the hill with the shotgun. And he's literally, he can't hear anything in either ear because one of his ears.
He was deaf in one ear.
And then they shot right in front of the other with the muzzle. So you're just hearing this. And, he's walking up and Robert Patrick's like, what the fuck are you doing, Freddy? Get back. And you just hear this muffled and he's like, I'm going to get, and it's just such a profoundly well choreographed moment, especially with Ray Liotta. I mean, I love him coming in at the end. There's a scene where Ray Liotta is like driving away at the end. Well, and he's looking in the rearview mirror and he's like, shut up. Will you shut the fuck up? And he's talking to himself. He's like, his conscience is getting him. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, man, love that movie. Love James Mangold. Yeah, and the ending, spoilers if you haven't seen it, but the ending is similar in the sense that it's really like he sticks to his guns as far as just wanting to turn them in, basically, and to end it. People do die, but that's because shots are fired at him and whatnot. But all the way up to, and, especially after you had mentioned the fact that they literally go after the one thing that is probably the most punishing thing they could do short of killing him, which is to try to make him go deaf in his other ear. And all that, notwithstanding, he still tries to walk the road of actual policing. And it's a good movie. Yeah, it's like you said about High Noon. It is very like that. And it's interesting because that scene in The Big Heat where Banyan throws down his badge, it really reminded me of the very end of High Noon, which I think had only been released like 6 months before this Big Heat started being written. So it feels like they're part of a continuum. Yeah.
Well, those are our picks for the A-list here on Sex in the City. So I gotta put this baby back in his case because the sun's about to rise. But well, I don't know, maybe next time you're here, maybe stick around for a little bit. Projexploitation ain't going anywhere, and neither is Sex in the City. So from myself, Tricky Nick Cheney, and my partner in crime, and my friend in time, Dan Babylon Brooks, I want to say thank you for sitting down and imbibing. Look out for the next episode of Projexploitation, where we go to a whole new world.
I'm going in. I'll cover you. Like you said first, you didn't. Fine, I won't cover you. All right, cover me. You want me to fucking cover you or not? I need you to cover me. Fine, I'll cover you. Just needs an end, Max. I don't have an end.